Well, peace be with you. My brothers and sisters at Christ the Redeemer Catholic Church in Thibodaux, Louisiana, I greet you this morning with the peace of Jesus Christ. Just a mere 3 weeks before I get to see you again in person, and until we see each other soon, be assured that I am indeed in communion with you across the miles, as together we rest in the heart of Jesus Christ. And from there, I greet you in the words of St. Paul as I say, peace be with you. My heart is full of gratitude this morning on this 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time, namely for the blessings that we celebrated this past week with our Vacation Bible Camp. This week, we welcomed literally hundreds of young students from across the Thibodaux area as they joined us for a week of catechesis and formation in youth ministry, and to all those who labored behind the scenes, all those who worked one-on-one with our students, or anybody who administratively put things together. A big thank you from my heart to your heart. Thanks for your service. Thanks for your generosity. Thank you for opening up your heart to the heart of Jesus Christ and letting Him work in you and with you and through you during the week. And I also want to say thanks to God. I think it's important for us to stop at moments like this and be reminded that everything that we received this week came straight from His heart and from His blessings. He came through and He answered our prayers. And stopping this morning and acknowledging that everything really came from Him kind of grounds us in a posture of humility and puts us in a position to receive His blessings in the future. Great things happening in Thibodaux and great things happening for us here in Omaha at the Institute for Priestly Formation. This past week marked the conclusion of our 7th week of the 10-week summer, and great things continuing to unfold. Our 169 seminarians in the summer program begin their final course of the summer, a course on the liturgy. And during the week, we introduced the church's vision for the liturgy, and over the next 3 weeks, we'll unpack the nuances of that vision, as well as deepen their understanding of how the liturgy is lived in the life and spirituality of a diocesan priest. The 22 priests and seminarians on the 30-day retreat wrapped up their second full week of the retreat, and today, the 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time, marks day 15 of the retreat. And we fully expect the second half of the retreat to continue to be marked by the same blessings of the first half of the retreat. So let's keep praying together for the men on the 30-day, that their vocations would be restored, their hearts set free, and their lives transformed. We also had an extraordinary privilege of welcoming Cardinal DiNardo to IPF. Cardinal DiNardo, of course, the Cardinal Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, right there to the west of us in Texas, joined us this week for a few days of reception and reflection. And with His Eminence, we also welcomed over 30 visitors from across the country, joining us as guests of the Cardinal and learning more about IPF, our mission, and why Blessed John Paul II has said that priestly formation is one of the most important tasks for the future evangelization of humanity. So deeply grateful for Cardinal DiNardo's presence, and I would ask that each of us, as we continue to pray for IPF, that we would continue to intercede for our friends who joined us this week, that God would deepen the graces that they received, and that He would guide their discernment about how they might be called to join the mission of IPF and the renewal of the priesthood. Finally, I find myself anticipating the 4th week of our Follow Me series, this 6-week series designed to help us draw deeper into the life of Christ and the practical implications of following Him in our daily lives. During week 1 of this series, we asked 2 really important questions. Do we really believe that Jesus is who He says He is? And then, of course, if that's true, then are we ready to follow Him? Now, trusting that the desire to follow Him is actually His desire in us. In the 2nd week, we went to unpack the particular details that we're going to immediately discover as we begin to follow Christ. Namely, that the way that Jesus looks at the world is going to be very different than the way that we look at the world. That the priorities that Jesus has are very different than the priorities of the culture that we come in. It's important for us to know this so that we're not surprised by the difference in following Christ and following the world, so that in those early days of following Him, we don't look back on the way that we were living and miss that and go back to that. Finally, last week we were reminded of Jesus' words were specifically, follow me. 2 words. And that second word is really important. He said, follow me. We're not following simply teachings or miracles or a crowd. Certainly we know that Jesus taught and He performed miracles, and we certainly know that there was a crowd. However, we're following Him. We're not following what He does. We're following a person. And as we follow a person, it's going to be Jesus Christ that we deepen our relationship with. So we know that we're called a relationship, and our relationship is with a very specific person. And so last week we talked about 5 keys to a healthy, mature prayer life. Keys or steps that help deepen our habit or our experience of prayer so that we can grow in our relationship with Christ. Today, I'd like to stay in the theme of relationship with Christ as the real lens to understand what it means to follow Him. Basically, there's a difference between observing Jesus and following Jesus. Observing Jesus is not following Him. We can't be disengaged from the process. We can't stay on the fringe simply looking at what He's doing in other people's lives. If we're not going to follow Him, we have to participate in the very proclamation and presence of the kingdom that was central to Jesus' life. We can't just watch Him teach other people. We have to be open to that very same wisdom in our lives. We can't just watch Him extend mercy to other people. We have to open up our hearts to receive that very mercy in our own lives. We can't just watch Him reach out to other people. We have to let Him approach us as He wants to reach out to us. And of course, we can't watch Him transform other people's lives. We have to ask ourselves, where do we need conversion in our own lives? If we're going to follow Jesus, if we're going to pray in an authentic relationship, if we're going to draw close to the person of Jesus Christ, then we have to be engaged in the process. Our heart has to be engaged in the process. And that means that we're going to begin to see Jesus in a different way. We actually let Jesus reveal Himself to us, not projecting who we want Jesus to be, but we're going to let Jesus reveal who He really is, and we're going to begin to see Him through His eyes. Quote number 1 from today's notes for the talk today reminds us that God looks at the world not through our eyes, but God looks at the world through His eyes. And that means that God looks at us through His eyes. And when we grow in relationship with Christ, we begin to see ourselves through the way that He sees us. That's what the church is saying in Gaudium et Spes, number 22, when it says that Jesus fully reveals man to himself. When we get to know Jesus, we're going to see ourselves as Jesus sees us. And Jesus is going to reveal the truth of who we are, regardless of what we see about ourselves or what we don't see about ourselves. Jesus sees us purely and through His eyes, which are divine eyes. And therefore, Jesus is going to show us who we really are. He's going to reveal the truth about what's really going on in our lives. And that's really good news. Isaiah 43 says, "Do not fear. I have redeemed you. I've called you by name and you are mine, because you are precious in my eyes." He sees us through His eyes and He loves us. He loves us purely. However, His love is so pure that it sees everything. He sees our desire. He sees our hearts as they really are. He sees our history. He sees our fear. He sees our resistance. He sees our patterns. Like when Jesus sees us, He sees everything. And we're going to come to see more clearly our patterns of how we move close to Him and how we move away from Him, because we each do that. We each take one step close to Jesus and we take one step back. We take 3 steps closer to the Lord and then we take 2 steps back. And it says back and forth. And of course, every one of us knows that we do the very things that we don't want to do. Of course, we have the desire to follow Him, but every one of us does things that we don't want to do. St. Paul knew that. He began to follow Christ in his own life. And as he began to see himself as Christ sees him, he actually began to see everything that was beautiful about St. Paul, and he began to see the very things about himself that he didn't like. If you look at the notes in Romans chapter 7, St. Paul writes, "What I do not understand. For I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate." Ever been there? Ever have the desire to live for Christ and to follow Him, only to turn around and do the very things that you don't want to do? Like I do that. At least Paul is courageous enough to admit that when he sees himself as Christ sees him, he also recognizes patterns in his life that actually pull him away from communion. Now let's just stop for a second. Well, what are the things that you do that pull you away from Christ? What are the patterns that you have in your life that actually pull you out of communion? What are the things that you do that you don't understand? What are the repetitive sins that are those patterns? And perhaps most importantly, how do you feel about those? How do you feel about the sins that won't go away? Or how do you feel about the patterns in your life that pull you away from Christ? Like, to be honest with you, sometimes I hate mine. And a lot of times I'm very confused by why I do what I do. St. Paul hated his. He actually begged God 3 times, just take my weakness away from me. And he's confused on why he does those things. And that's why he writes, "What I do not understand." We have to admit this pattern within us, because at some point as we follow Jesus and we grow in relationship with the person of Christ, that Christ is going to want to get close to us. He's going to want to get very close to us. He's going to want to get intimately close with us in our lives. And one of the classic patterns that we have is that we resist Jesus when he wants to get very close to us. I know that a lot of us get frustrated when it seems that he's real far away, but a lot of us actually resist him when he gets really close to the places in our hearts that are filled with shame or pain or fear, or he just wants to touch the things about us that we don't like. When he gets too close, a lot of times we just push him away. So if you go back to the notes, Deacon James Keating articulates this pattern in number 5 as he says, "With ever more accurate darts of love, the Holy Spirit opens our consciences before God so that deeper and more effective healing can occur. At times, his coming is so pure that it causes us to have pain and recoil at the level of intimacy that God wishes to have in our being." Let's look at that quote together. "With ever more accurate darts of love." God knows exactly where to go. He knows exactly where to go with his love. There's these little accurate darts of love. There's an intentionality about Jesus' movement in our life. Keating writes that the Holy Spirit opens our consciences before God. That God's love wants to open our hearts. In any place that's closed, any door that's locked, any area of our life that's filled with pain, any unhealed memory, of course, God with his accurate darts of love is going to want to open that place in our life. And what happens is, as he says in the quote, that his coming is so pure that it actually causes us to have pain and recoil at the level of intimacy that Jesus wants to have with us. So don't be surprised if when you recognize that Jesus is getting really close, that we actually recoil. We want to run away. We push God away because we're afraid that he's getting too close. And he wants to open these places of our hearts, but a lot of times you and I can just be afraid of what's going to happen if we open that place of our heart. Why would God want to come? Why would he want to open up our hearts? Well, of course we know that's so that he can bring freedom. If God desires communion more than anything else, and those places in our hearts that resist communion or run away from communion are the very things that are preventing us, then of course God's going to want to open those spaces of our hearts so that he can bring freedom and healing. If you look at number 6 in the notes, our Holy Father in Jesus of Nazareth says that healing is an essential dimension of the apostolic mission and of Christianity. And when understood at a sufficiently deep level, this expresses the entire content of redemption. That everything that can be said about Jesus, everything that can be said about his mission, everything that can be said about salvation history can be said through this image of healing. Blessed John Paul II said that there are 2 gestures that are characteristic of the person of Jesus and his mission, and that is healing and forgiveness. So why would Jesus want to open up our hearts? Well, because healing is not something that Jesus does. Healing and mercy and pure love and forgiveness, that is who Jesus is. So healing is an essential part of Jesus. It's an essential part of our relationship with Jesus. And of course, if Jesus is going to heal us, we have to recognize and admit there are places in our life that need healing. So how do you know where you need healing, or how do you know where Jesus wants to come? Well, it's just important for us to be reminded that Jesus is going to reveal it to us, as we said from Gaudium et Spes, that Jesus fully reveals man to himself. God's going to reveal who we really are in him. He's going to reveal the truth of our identity, and he's going to reveal the places in our hearts that need the light to shine in the darkness, you might say. Number 8 from the quote in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, he says that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. You might look at Jesus as perfect light. You might look at Jesus as pure light. And then when his pure light shines, it's going to shine everywhere, and it's going to even illumine the shadows of our own heart or the darkness that's in our own life. Let me give you a concrete example of it. or a practical image perhaps that might help out. This past week, as we welcomed Cardinal Donato to campus, we welcomed those 30 guests who were joining us to learn more about the mission. And so we had several receptions, and at each of those receptions, I had the opportunity to be there to not only share my own heart, but to listen to the hearts of those who were joining us for the week. So I was getting ready for each of those receptions, and I was surprised this week that the bathroom light in my suite was out. As I was kind of getting ready for one of the receptions, I was trying to look my best, and I was shaving my head, and I was trying to do that, and the light in my bathroom wasn't really working that well. Now, I have to say that we have incredible facilities here at Creighton. They are usually on top of things. They have incredible service, and so I called down the maintenance and asked them to come up, but I was, of course, running late, as I always am. So I was kind of shaving my head. And I was doing the best I could in the light that was provided for me, but I kind of missed a few spots. Now, I didn't know that. There were imperfections in the way that I was getting ready. There were imperfections as I was shaving my head, but I couldn't see that because the light in the bathroom wasn't working as it was designed to work. So, sure enough, just as I finished things up, here comes maintenance. They walk in my room. They actually fix the light, and as they fixed the valance and they put a new bulb in, like now the bathroom was bright, and the whole bathroom was lit up. I could see in the brighter light the things that I couldn't see in the more dimly lit bathroom. The bright light revealed the imperfections. The bright light revealed the places that I had missed. The bright light revealed everything that was hidden in the darkness. And if that's true, and that example, the same is true as we follow Jesus, what's going to happen is His bright light is going to reveal every place in our heart that needs His love and every place in our heart that resists communion. And of course, He's going to want to open up our hearts. He's going to want to even show us our patterns of sin or our patterns of resistance or our patterns of fear, simply so that He can draw us close to Him, simply that He can show us how we can stay in communion with Him. Like He only comes close to heal. But if He's going to come close and if He's going to bring healing, then He's going to have to take us deeper than the surface. A lot of times He's going to have to take us deeper into the actual roots. The Catechism says in number 1853, number 9 in the notes, the church says that the root of sin is the heart of man. That deeper than our action of sin, there's actually something that's causing us to sin or leading us to sin or drawing us into sin, or what Deacon Keating calls our affection for sin. We're going to have to get to the roots. Let me give you another example. I think a lot of times you and I, when we look at our lives of sin or our lives of resistance, we just kind of expect to give it all to the priest in the sacrament of reconciliation, and we hope that our sin just goes away. But of course, we know it doesn't. We know that we continue to struggle with often the same sins or the same patterns over and over. And what we see in the natural world can often shed light for us in the supernatural world. So let's look at something from the natural world. You know, Christ the Redeemer, the church back in Thibodaux, is surrounded by sugarcane on all three sides. And what we know from the natural world is that when they harvest the sugarcane in the fall, if all the conditions are right, if the circumstances are favorable, and we do nothing, that sugarcane is going to actually grow back on its own because it's designed to do so. You can cut down the sugarcane, you can get rid of it, you might say, but if the conditions are correct and favorable, it's going to grow back. So none of us would be surprised when the sugarcane grows back in, April or May, because we expect that nature is going to do that because the roots of the sugarcane run deep. And it's those roots that actually cause it to grow back. Well, if that's true with sugarcane, if that's true in the natural world, then why should we be surprised in the supernatural world when it seems like we can't beat our sin? When it seems like that sin just keeps growing in our life, even when we might say we harvest it and we give it away. Well, it's because there's a root system. There's something deep in our hearts that is causing that sin to grow in our life. And that's what Jesus wants to come close to. That's what He wants to open. That's where His light wants to shine. Why? So that we can be free, that He can bring freedom and healing into our lives. That's what's so encouraging today about the image of the Good Samaritan that we see for us in today's gospel. On this 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time, we see this image of the Good Samaritan that, as you look at the notes that are provided for us today, you'll notice Pope Benedict XVI, quoting the Desert Fathers and the early church, actually encourages us to look at the Good Samaritan as an image of Jesus. And if Jesus is the Good Samaritan, then that of course means that all of us are he who has been left alone, he who has been wounded, he who is in need of healing. That's all of us. The person that Jesus is ministering today in the gospel, that's all of us. And as Jesus comes close, as Jesus takes the initiative, he knows exactly where, as the gospel reveals, where to put that oil and that wine. So what are the areas of our heart that need healing? So let's go ahead and take a look at areas of our heart that would actually resist God coming close. And as we kind of talk about this, as we talk about our need for healing, like I know that we're on holy ground, and so I really share my heart with you very reverently right now as you're listening to the places that God might want to come close in your life. If you just look at the notes, the first image there, of course, we acknowledge that we've all lived imperfect lives with imperfect people and imperfect situations. And a lot of times in life, we experience a woundedness. We experience situations in life that you might say wound us. And I think for a lot of us, the more influential wounds in our heart came from our childhood. Let me give you lots of different examples, and maybe some of these examples touch close to home, and maybe some of them don't, and you see them in other people. But just to give you some examples of wounds. Maybe it's divorce, childhood divorce. If parents split and kids are in the mix and the kids are young, then a lot of times that divorce has a traumatic impact on a child. That's a wounding experience. Or maybe it's death. You know, a lot of times when we're young and we come face to face with death, we don't have the answers to our questions, and the pain that's there just kind of hurts us. And experiencing death when you're a child can be a very traumatic or wounding experience. And of course, we know that any form of abuse, and I say this very reverently, whether it's physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional abuse, that when a child, or at any point in our life, whenever we experience that type of abuse, that's a wounding experience in our life. Maybe it's just a transition from place to place. I think a lot of us, especially if it's because of death or divorce, if we were forced to move into a whole new experience with a whole new set of social circumstances, or had to let go of friends and family, that can be a wounding experience in our life. Or simply being parented by imperfect parents can be sometimes a wounding experience. To be constantly compared to your other siblings, or feeling like you're never living up to the expectations of your father or your mother or the people around you, sometimes that can be a wounding experience. And there are thousands of others. I'm just trying to give you some concrete, practical examples of areas of our heart that might be wounded. And if you look at the diagram of the anatomy there, what we know is that wounds are filled with pain. It just hurts. And what usually surrounds pain is fear. Fear that we're alone. Fear that we're going to be trapped there, or fear that we're always going to be stuck there. Like whatever it is, a lot of times what surrounds pain is fear. And when we experience a lot of pain and fear, we often feel out of control. And when we're out of control, we naturally seek something that we can control, like an answer. Let me give you a concrete example. I've been a priest for 12 years now, and of course I've done tons of funerals, and every one of those funerals has been an incredible experience for me as a priest, and I know that I'm being invited into people's lives at a very cherished time and opportunity. And you know the most commonly asked question at a funeral? Why? Why did God allow cancer? Or why did my husband or my wife or my child or my brother, my sister, my friend die? Why? And I think when we're in pain, especially at funerals, a lot of people ask why. Well, why are they asking that question? Well, because they're out of control and they want something that they can control. Our sense of control kind of numbs our feeling of pain and out of control, and it gives something that we can focus on and center all of our energy on it. And a lot of times that happens in us, and so what gets wrapped around the pain and the fear is a series of lies a lot of times. Let me give you an example. Like it's my fault, or I'm dirty, or I'm ashamed, or I am shame, or I'm a failure, or other people don't love me, or God was not there, or I was alone or abandoned. There can be a series of lies that get wrapped around the wound in our heart. And what gets wrapped around those lies oftentimes is a series of vows, promises that we make to ourselves, or decisions of our will that are in direct response to the lie. So I give you some examples of vows. I'm never going to be like my father, or I'm always going to succeed, or if I fail, I'm going to hide them, or I'm always going to be right, or I'll do whatever it takes to be loved. Whatever it is, I think a lot of us have the own particular nuances of that, and as the Lord reveals Himself to you, and as He reveals yourself to yourself, perhaps you become familiar with those vows. But let's take a look at the big picture here. So inside our heart, what needs to be healed, a lot of times is a wound. Wounds are filled with pain. Pains are usually wrapped with lies, and what's around the lies are the vows. And so when St. Paul says, I don't know why I do what I do, well, this is why he does what he does, or this is why you and I often do the very things that we don't want to do, because there's this whole system of thought that lives within us around those wounds that actually drives the decisions in our life, and oftentimes that's what drives us into sin. And so when Jesus wants to get close to us, a lot of times He wants to get close to these structures of belief or this anatomy of a wound. And as He gets close, bam, we recoil at the level of intimacy that He wants to have as He gets that close to us. As Jesus gets close to that kind of pain, then of course you and I would kind of run. And so what happens as we run, or as we put up our walls, then we're isolated there. And where we're not in communion with God, then of course God's going to want to bring communion. Look at number 11. Blessed John Paul II, in his great document on the Sacrament of Reconciliation, describes very well that our refusal of communion, our resistance, our recoiling, you might say, imprisons us in isolation and division. Like, that's an incredible quote. And I think that's why we do the very things we don't want to do, because we're refusing communion and we're now imprisoned in isolation. And at some point, you just can't manage life all by yourself, or you can't fix everything in your life. We are imprisoned in isolation, and eventually we're just going to medicate, and that's usually why we grasp at sin, or we recoil from Jesus, because we're just trying to medicate our interior pain. So here's the good news. Here's the beauty of today's gospel. Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan, who the Holy Father says is an image of Jesus. As you and I are right there, as we are left in the gospel, as we have these places in our life where we need healing, here comes Jesus, this beautiful image of the Good Samaritan. He's got the wine and the oil that are in the parable, and He knows exactly where to go with His love. I've given you an image of the Good Samaritan in the notes for today. It's a beautiful painting from Johann Karl Loth. And if you look at the image, just notice the Good Samaritan on the right, and of course you and I are depicted on the left. Notice the precision of the Good Samaritan in the painting. He knows exactly where to go. Deacon Keating calls it these accurate darts of love. He knows exactly where to go with his love. And notice the docility of the man who's been left alone. The man on the left, he's so docile, he's just letting God do what He wants to do. And there's a real difference between letting God in versus giving it to God. I want to conclude with two very important thoughts. And the first is really theologically sound, that I think a lot of us come face to face with the fact that we can't let go. And I think people tell us things all the time in attempts to make us feel better. They say things like, well, just give that to God. Well, to be honest with you, I don't know how to give everything to God. When I come face to face with like my wounds or my pain or my lies or my vows, like those things actually protect us. In some kind of really weird way, we hold on to those things because we don't want to let Jesus into our pain, because for a lot of us, the first time we felt that pain, we were alone. How do we give all that away? Well, a lot of times we can't. Well, there's another way. Hey, Jesus, I give you permission to come in. And of course, when He comes, He's only going to bring healing. That's what we've been talking about today. He's only going to bring light. His light always shines in the darkness. He's only going to bring love. The reason that we talked about that Jesus is who He says He is in that first week is because we need to make sure that the person who we're letting is who He says He is. He is pure mercy. He is perfect love. He is our Savior and our Redeemer. He has come to bring liberty to the captives, recover your sight to the blind, to let the oppressed and the imprisoned go free. That's who's coming close to us. And that's who's taken the first step. Notice that in the image of the Good Samaritan, it's Jesus who takes the initiative. It's the Good Samaritan who approaches. And all we have to do is let him in. The church says in number 2567 that God calls us first, that his initiative of love always comes first. God has taken the initiative. My brothers and sisters, be reminded today that God wants your freedom and your healing more than you do. And he's taken the initiative to bring freedom and healing. And if we follow him, he's going to take the initiative to free us. So what we need to do is we need to let God come close. We need to just simply give him permission to come into our lives. And if we trust that he wants to give us himself, and if we allow that to happen, then that's where healing is known, when we let God in. Number 14, for us to be reminded today that whoever truly wishes to heal man must see him in his wholeness and must know that it is Jesus that is our ultimate healing. That's what the Holy Father is saying, that only God's love can bring us ultimate healing and freedom. That's what we want. And the core of the pain, the core of the wound, and the core of everything that's there, what we ultimately want is we just want to know that God's there with us. And finally, from Deacon Keating, the healing occurs as the wound is acknowledged, the lies are unveiled, and the light of Jesus' love reveals the truth. Why is it that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and the truth will set you free? Like Jesus says, the truth sets us free. Why is it? Well, because Jesus knows the human heart. He knows that we have lies in our heart and vows in our heart. And if Jesus tells us the truth about our lies, then we no longer need the vows, of course. Those things eventually kind of peel away. And if we know the truth of who he is, that he's pure love, that we are precious in his eyes, then we can let him into the pain, knowing that the light always fills the darkness, that mercy always feels shame, that his presence always feels fear in places where we're isolated, that he just wants to come in and he just wants to be with us. Now this is where following Christ gets real personal, and for a lot of people it gets real difficult. This is where a lot of us run. This is where a lot of us kind of back away, because when we realize that he wants to come in to our hearts right here, this is where a lot of people like shut down. And so I want to encourage you, don't do that. The Lord has brought you here. If you're listening to this talk, that's because God is knocking on your heart, and he wants access to anything that's been closed off, or any place that you feel alone, or anything in your heart that's just not of him. Like he wants to fill that with his presence. So I invite you, if you can right now, to look at the image of the Good Samaritan that I've given you. If you don't have it in front of you, maybe just kind of think about the areas of your heart where he wants to touch. Jesus loves you perfectly and purely. He can be trusted, I promise you that. And we need not be afraid. As you and I follow Jesus, eventually we're going to know in our own lives that he wants to bring freedom and healing in our hearts. That this week is a big week for you. I invite you to really pray your way through the week. And as we join each other again for the 5th week, we'll talk more practically about how to follow him. But over the next week, let's keep praying for each other. Over the next week, let's let him in and simply give him permission. And in the next week, let's trust that Jesus, the Good Samaritan, is only knocking on our hearts to bring us freedom, restoration, and a transformed life. God bless you.